Hey, what's going on, guys? This is our chapter one lecture, and we're talking about Africa from around 6000 BCE to around 1600 in the Common Era. So, this is an African American history class, but we talk about ancient Africa because most African Americans today trace their heritage mainly to West Africa, and then there's a sizable minority that traces their heritage to Central Africa. And so later on, we'll talk about, a lot of cultural transference and a lot of West African heritage that is brought with the folks that are forcibly brought here via the Middle Passage and how they make their imprint on the Europeans and Native Americans that they interact with. And so we're kind of getting to the cultural roots of it. So let's take a look. So we're just looking at, the geographical characteristics of Africa, where we'll also discuss, the origins of humanity. We'll briefly look at some ancient African civilizations, and we'll kind of touch on why West Africa specifically is significant in African American history. Okay. We'll look at the legacy of West African society and culture and how it influenced the way African Americans live later on. Okay. All right. So Africa is the second largest continent in the world. All right. And I'll show you on a map here in a second. But when you look at Africa, look at it from north to south because you see a succession of climatic zones. I always say that Africa is like a bullseye when it comes to climatic zones, and I'll explain that a little bit, more clearly in a second. But you're going to see desert, savanna, rainforest, and mountain ranges. And you guys, if you don't know, rainforest is a dense growth of tall trees, characteristic rather hot, wet regions, lots of rainfall. Let's take a look. All right, so like I said, it's kind of like a bullseye. So this is a, equatorial rainforest right here. All right, and then as you move out, from that equatorial rainforest, you move into the savanna or grasslands, right? So this is a tropical grassland. There's lots of average rainfall, and so savanna, tropical grasslands, tropical grasslands. Okay, all right. So as you move even further north and south, you're going to run into dry grassland um, or steppe. So this is so rainforest, savanna, Sahel, which is very dry grassland, in the north and south. And then as you move even farther out, of course, you've got the largest hot desert in the world, the Sahara Desert, which comprises a sizable portion of northern Africa, and then you've got the Kalahari and Namib deserts in the south. So as you move north or south of the equator, you're finding some similarities, and of course that's not unequivocal. Like you can see, there's tropical grassland here, there's desert here, there's rainforest on the Guinea coast up here. But generally speaking, it's kind of a good way to think about it. All right. So all humans trace their ancestry to the same sort of matrilineal ancestor that existed in what is today Ethiopia, between 2.5 million and 4.5 million years ago. So when we're talking about the earliest hominids, the Ardipithecines, we're talking about 4.5 million years ago. Hominids, when you think hominid, just think of like a primate. And then, the closest ancestors to modern humans, Homo habilis, who are tool users around 2.4 million years ago in the savanna regions of Africa. And a lot of these remains we found in some valleys in Ethiopia. Um, some interesting things to think about. So, why do humans walk upright? And I heard one theory, and it's that they started to do it to look over tall grass, for like predators and things like that. And then the ones that would stand up and look over tall grass survived, while those that didn't make a habit of doing that did not survive. And so if you've ever, taken biology class and learned about natural selection, you know that species with traits that are favored by the environment survive to pass on their genes, while those that don't do not. And so humans didn't evolve, you know, standing upright so they could hold tools. They started to walk upright because that was favorable in the environment, and then they found their hands free, and that allowed them to use tools. So anyway, different reasons out there. Just kind of interesting stuff. All right, so Homo habilis had a larger brain than Ardipithecus, and bigger brains also sort of caused some interesting things to happen. So like large brain, you know, um, human ancestors, couldn't be born with a fully developed brain, obviously for, obvious reasons, right? So they had to be born with an underdeveloped brain in order for them to, a woman to be able to give birth to them, right? So that means that unlike other species, when they're born, they're virtually helpless. Like think about like a deer. A deer is born and can like get up and walk like shortly after being born. Like a human infant can't walk for almost a year, right? Can't feed themselves, really can't, they're completely helpless. So that means that humans and our ancestors have to have like a family unit to care for the human child, right? And a lot of times that's like, there's a lot of work involved there. So like you ever heard the phrase like it takes a village? that doesn't come from nowhere. So literally what you get because of these big brains is an extended family unit, which we call a clan, and when we're talking about, hunter-gatherer civilization, they traveled around in large extended family units called clans, which are the predecessors to villages. Once humans invent agriculture, those clans set up shop, and become sedentary, and clans become villages, and what you're going to find is in ancient Africa, a big thing was that if you were going to get married and start a family, you had to do that with somebody from another village because you were probably related to everybody in your village because it was, that clan. And so a lot of times, you would find your significant other from another village, and then one of you would leave. A lot of times, the wife would go and stay in the other village. All right, so interesting stuff. Birthplace of humanity. All right, Homo erectus was the first human to use fire, which is a pretty big deal. Like we could prepare food and make it edible and safe outside of our bodies. And so that opened us up to whole new sources of protein, and of course later on, like, that's going to mean we're going to keep animals, and that's going to allow us to, pull plows and transport goods and get exposed to diseases and build resistances to diseases. So, okay, I'm getting into the weeds with this a little bit, but you get the idea. Two theories of where we all came from. All right, you've got the out of Africa model and the multi-regional model. And I'm going to be honest with you up front. I'm a little biased. I tend to follow this one because it just makes more sense to me. And the genetic evidence is, kind of leans toward this one. So Homo sapiens, according to the multi-regional model, our modern humans came from regional populations in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Basically, they came from regional populations of Homo erectus in multiple places around the same time, whereas the out of Africa model suggests that modern humans emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago and then began migrating out of Africa 100,000 years ago. Genetic evidence does support both of these models, and also shows that we're all closely related. According to the Eve hypothesis, all humans on the planet share the same matrilineal ancestors. So it's like your great to the whatever exponent, um, uh, grandmother, mitochondrial Eve. Though they look simple, these are complicated tools that our Homo erectus ancestors used. I actually watched a video, and there's a anthropologist who tried to make these, and you're thinking, okay, big deal. You just chip a stone, and and it's actually a pretty precise kind of skill set making these stone age, tools, if you will, like, axes, shovels, spears, things like that. Like, there are very precise strikes that have to be performed, and it's really easy to mess these things up and ruin them. And it took them a really long time to do it effectively. So, like, that's another kind of interesting thing is like somebody had to learn to do this, just like you would have a blacksmith, and then that blacksmith would teach their trade to somebody else. Somebody had to be a stonesmith, if you will. That's not really a term, but you get the idea. Like, they had to learn the skill, and then they had to pass it on to somebody else, which just shows how communication, over time, our ancestors that were able to communicate better were more likely to survive, and hence communication being so important to our species today. Okay. All right. So skipping past tens and thousands of years, right? We're looking at Egypt and Mesopotamia. These are similar places, but they're very, very different because of the geography. So, like, ancient Mesopotamia developed what we would almost call a culture of pessimism, right? Where, like, essentially there was no heaven or hell in ancient Mesopotamian religious belief. When you died, you basically went to a place where it was always dark and you were always hungry and thirsty, but you could only eat dust. And, like, that's some of the writing that we found on clay tablets says essentially like, um, I grow my crops, but a flash flood comes and wipes them all out. And if that doesn't happen, a stranger comes and he takes them. And if that doesn't happen, the animals come and they destroy them. So why were they so pessimistic? Well, they lived on a floodplain. And so essentially what would happen all the time, and you guys learned like about the, Taurus and Zagros mountains, and how, basically without warning at any time, ice melt or, rains or whatever would overflow the Euphrates and the Tigris randomly. And because they all lived on a vast expanse plain of sun-baked mud interrupted only by the occasional date palm tree, flash floods would just destroy their village. I mean, and think about it, like mud was literally like their most basic material. You didn't find a lot of trees, like I said, in ancient Mesopotamia. So mud brick was used for everything, temples, homes, etc. And think about, like, what does water do to mud? It dissolves it. So literally, at any moment, a flash flood would come along, wipe out their crops, destroy all their buildings, and kill them. And because it's also a big open plain, you would constantly have invaders from all sides who would come in periodically and also destroy things and take over, and you'd see regime change. So, like the Assyrians, who are notoriously brutal, without getting too much into that. So, they lived, through invasions and upheaval and natural disasters. And so they were kind of pessimistic compared to the Egyptians, who had natural barriers like the Red Sea, like the cataracts on the Nile, like vast deserts. So they were able to actually maintain a pretty small standing army, and had relative peace and stability over time. And so that's why, Egyptian beliefs about life after death are pretty rosy compared to the Mesopotamians, and why their society was somewhat more progressive, female rulers, things like that. Um, so even though they're close, they're vastly different in terms of culture. Egyptian culture is also more intact over time. Something else that I want to point out is that Egypt is indisputably African. And there are more trade links with Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa than with Egypt and the Mediterranean world. Okay, there were black pharaohs. Many Egyptians were what we would consider, what we would call black people. But in our modern times, Egyptian civilization has almost always been portrayed as white civilization, which doesn't make sense. And so even like current recreations of Egyptian rulers have been criticized for portraying those folks as white. Look at this. I mean, these are older movies, right? I mean, Egyptians didn't look like this. And even in our, recent, I think this movie came out in 2015, like, and it was called Gods of Egypt. Like, these are all white folks, okay? And Egypt was an African civilization, and so Egyptian history has sort of been hijacked by sort of Europeans, and there's a distinctly Eurocentric narrative of Egyptian history that does not coincide with real Egyptian history, in which Nubian civilization really drove Egyptian culture. They had many black pharaohs. There were many black Egyptians, and certainly they didn't look like this. Okay, so rant over. Egypt was the gift of the Nile because, unlike the random flash floods that would wreak havoc in ancient Mesopotamia, the Nile would very predictably, and very gradually overflow its banks annually and provide that silt that you guys learned about in World History 1 that was so vital to agriculture. And so um, uh, the Nile was, this life-giving force, and Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the black land. And they called it this because of that dark silt soil that was the gift of the Nile, Kemet. Again, the Nile also, in addition to agriculture, allowed for transportation. Cataracts on the Upper Nile provided barriers to invaders. It's also a way for communication. Other geographic barriers, deserts, the Red Sea, allowed for Egyptian culture to stay intact, and it allowed them to be less militaristic, which is decidedly a good thing. Okay. Women could own property, hold public offices, and be in leadership positions. That's not really something that is contemporary with Egyptian civilization. A hieroglyphic writing system that is still widely recognized today, not used, of course, but we all know about and admire their hieroglyphic writing system. They were mostly polytheistic. They believed in many gods, with exception. And remember, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for 20 years. That's the um, recreation here that's been criticized for basically, for lack of a better term, being too white. Okay, so some other civilizations that you need to know about in relation to you know um, ancient Africa: Kush, Meroe, and Aksum. So Nubia is south of Egypt on the Upper Nile, and Nubians established the kingdom of Kush on the Upper Nile and took control of Upper Egypt. All right. And Upper Egypt, by Upper Egypt, I mean Southern Egypt. I know that that's a little counterintuitive, but remember the Nile flows out into the Mediterranean, right? So when we talk about Upper Egypt, we're talking about southern Egypt. I know that from our perspective, guys, remember North and South are just made up anyway. Okay, we're flying through space. There's no real North or South. So, all right. So, um, the Nubian king Pianki actually took control of Lower Egypt, as in Northern Egypt, in 750 BCE. Pianki then founded Egypt's 25th dynasty. The capital moved to Meroe in about 540 BCE, and this was Africa's first industrial center. Axum, in the first century BCE, became the first Christian state in sub-Saharan Africa. And there were Semitic, and if you don't know what that means, the term Semitic means relating to a family of languages that include Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. All right, so we're talking mainly about people who speak Semitic languages. Usually when you hear the term Semitic, people are talking about folks that speak Hebrew and Arabic, okay? All right, just to clear that up. So you can see that this is a pyramidal structure, and this is actually found in Meroe, but you can see where Nubian civilization played a very influential role in Egyptian culture. I mean, if you looked at this, and didn't know better, you'd say it was in Egypt, and that's because Nubian civilization left an indelible mark on Egyptian culture. And like I said, Nubians ruled Egypt for a long period of time. Okay, so West Africa. When I talk about West Africa, I'm talking about this specific area here. Most African Americans today trace their heritage to West Africa, particularly the Savannah and Forest region. And there are a tremendously diverse set of cultural and linguistic groups. To give you an idea, even today, there are like 400 different language groups in Nigeria, all right, alone. So there is tremendous ethnic, cultural diversity in Africa, and a lot of times people don't realize that, and they just sort of have a monolithic view of Africa. There are Africans in Africa, and that's not the case. Many different cultures and language groups there. All right. So the first kingdom we're looking at is ancient Ghana, which would have here in West Africa, Kingdom of Ghana, and with the cosmopolitan city of Kumbi-Salah, home to 20 to 30,000 people, which rivaled any city of its day. Founded by the Soninke people, they derived their wealth from trade, and the camel is extremely important. Why do you think that is? What trade routes are they using? The Sahara, trans-Saharan trade routes. So you got to have camel trains to transport things across the Sahara, no question about it. And so the camel really makes that possible, and the way the horse makes trade possible elsewhere. Chief exports are pepper, spices were a big deal. All right, slaves and gold to Roman and later Arab merchants. They're conquered by Islamic Berbers, who were indigenous people of North Africa, who we also call the Almoravids. All right. The Empire of Mali lasts from about 1230 to 1468 in the Common Era. That's founded by the Mandinka, and they're led by Sundiata. All right. Their wealth is based on gold and taxation. And the population grows to about 8 million people. It's a huge empire for that time. A lot of times when we hear about Timbuktu, people are talking about like the middle of nowhere, right? Which is crazy because Timbuktu was the cosmopolitan center of trade and learning in the world during this time. It's one of the most affluent, diverse, advanced cities in the world. It sits at a very convenient bend in the Niger River. It was known for its religious tolerance, Europeans that visited it talked about how just the rulers there were. It reached its peak under one of the wealthiest rulers the world's ever seen, Mansa Musa, and you can see him here. This is his entourage, and he would just travel around with all of these followers, camel trains laden with gold, and wherever he went, the economy would just explode because he would pump so much wealth into it. All right, so Songhai is the last of the great West African empires. Its rulers were great traders. The first king of Songhai was Sunni Ali. It's separated from Mali in 1375, and they built the last and largest of the what we call the Sudanese empires, Western Sudan, and I'll show you that on a map in a second. Sunni Ali was its first king, kind of a warrior king that really kind of carved the empire out of Mali. Later on, Muhammad Touré, also known as Askia the Great, um, uh, expanded the empire. It went into decline after its army was destroyed by Spanish mercenaries in 1591. European influence began to spread because there was no powerful West African empire to challenge them. And eventually, later on, when Britain outlaws the transatlantic slave trade, they'll kind of use that power vacuum as an excuse to colonize Africa. But we'll talk about that later. This is from the Battle of Tondibi, which this is what I was talking about, those Spanish mercenaries. Moroccan forces defeated Askia Ishak II, kind of guaranteeing Songhai's downfall. So, like I said, this is Central Sudan, Western Sudan. This is Songhai. Okay, there's Timbuktu. So the West African forest region is more sparsely populated, just because they can't really practice the same types of large-scale agriculture that they can, say, in the grasslands. So you have small amounts of people that migrate into the forest region over time. And what that results in is more cultural diversity, because as these small groups migrate into the forest region, they all kind of develop their own independent culture. So it's, like I said, sparsely populated, predominantly hunter-gatherer societies. You do get small kingdoms in this part of Africa, most notably Benin. Okay, people of the forest region will end up playing a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, both as traders and victims. All right, this is the Mosque of Djenne. All right, which was built in the 14th century. It's a World Heritage Site. Once a year, there's a guy called the architect, and they come out and they replaster this thing. And they've been replastering it with a special type of mud, for, over 600 years now. Now, technically, the current structure only dates back to about 1907, but the Mosque of Djenne has been there since the 13th century, and it's in the city of Djenne, which is in Mali. Okay, it's pretty cool. All right, and if we have an opportunity, I'll show you guys a video about it. So here are those trans-Saharan trade routes that I talked a little bit about. There's things like pepper. Salt was really important, especially in that part of the world where, replenishing salt in that kind of hot, dry environment was really important. Gold, slaves, etc. And you can see those linkages, those trans-Saharan trade routes that were so important, that link West Africa with the rest of the world. Okay, so there is a sizable minority of African Americans today who can trace their ancestry to Central Africa, namely Angola and the Congo region. And actually, many of the, if you ever take my U.S. history class, I talk about how, the first slaves to arrive in British North America arrived at Jamestown in 1619. And many of them were Angolan. They were actually taken off of another ship. So it grew after 1500, though it will become caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. Uh, the Kingdom of Congo welcomed and developed a relationship with Europeans, and Congo's rulers adopted Christianity, though there was resistance, namely a rebellion led by a 15-year-old girl named Dona Beatriz, who she had thousands and thousands of followers and sought to unify her people against the Europeans and against the slave trade. But eventually the kingdom does break up. All right, so like I said, people like to generalize about Africa. One of the most common arguments, and a really ignorant one that I hear, is that that African participation in the slave trade was somehow them selling their own people, which nothing could be further from the truth. Like, nobody talks about Europe in a monolithic kind of sense, right? Like when we talk about the Catholics and the Protestants fighting each other, when we talk about France and England fighting each other, and Spain, when we talk about in later years the struggle between England and Ireland, do we say that they were fighting their own people? No, because we look at the French and the English and the Spanish and the Germans as all distinct, right, as different people. We wouldn't say that they were fighting their own, but we don't, like that same attitude isn't applied to Africa. People like to just say, oh, okay, well, Africa, there are Africans in Africa. That is not the case. It's tremendously diverse in language, in culture, and the types of societies that you find there. And so it's dangerous to just generalize. And there's so many different traditions and oral histories, and so we'll get into those as we go through. Families and villages I already talked about, and they run the gamut. They're either patrilineal, where it's patriarchal, where males are in charge, or matrilineal, where a matriarch is the center of the family or village unit. They're the villages, just like the clans before them, are extended families. You're definitely going to find larger villages on the savannah where they practice sedentary agriculture, all sorts of tools and weapons, grinding stones to grind, they cultivate grasses and grind seeds into different things, ceramic vessels, bows and spears. Farming was difficult and continues to be. Africa, a lot of the arable land is carved out of rainforests, which, even though you would think rainforest soil would be lush and easily cultivated, it's not. And so farming was difficult. They cultivated millet, which is kind of like a grass seed, rice, and sorghum. Women in African society typically lived in male-dominated societies, although women do hold positions of power, and in some regions they could own property. Compared to their European contemporaries, women had more sexual freedom, so they could freely divorce their husbands, in some cases just by saying they wanted a divorce. And that's something that is taken for granted today. But in a lot of societies around this time, only men could divorce. And that's going to be the case in Europe for a really long time. Rites of passage in adulthood existed for boys and girls. A lot of times they had secret societies, basically, in which young boys and young girls would sort of go off separate from the rest of the village or whatever, and learn about the expectations, about the gender roles that had been assigned to them. Basically, like male honor, female virtue, that kind of stuff. So, so for example, the Poro is a men's secret society in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, and the Ivory Coast, which was under the Mande people. It's sometimes referred to as a hunting society. Only males were admitted into its ranks. There was a female counterpart to Poro known as the Sandy Society, where basically they said, okay, you're a girl, you're about to be a woman, this is what's expected of you. And so they would basically just directly teach these gender roles. We still do this kind of stuff a little bit, although we're getting better about it. But we still communicate gender roles to our children, in the sense that we say, okay, well, you're a boy, so this is what you're expected to do, and you're a girl, so this is what you're expected to do. We're getting away from that, I think. It's not necessarily a good thing, and so, but it is what it is. I digress. But anyway, moving on. Class and slavery existed throughout the world, and West Africa is no exception. By the way, this is Sunni Ali, the first king of Songhai. So most West Africans lived in hierarchical societies governed by monarchs. Sounds familiar? It should. All right, just like everywhere else, they had monarchs who claimed the divine right to rule. So these societies had classes. They had warrior classes, noble classes, merchant classes. There were bureaucrats. There were serfs and peasants. Slavery existed. It wasn't permanent and complete. And one common misconception is that, and what people will say is, oh, slavery was practiced everywhere. There was slavery in Africa. There was slavery in Rome, blah, blah, blah. And for whatever reason, people like to use that to sort of smooth over or lessen the impact of the slavery that was practiced in North America and later the United States. And I just want to point out right here from the get-go that the chattel slavery that existed in the Americas is unique in history. It is a European invention, and it is distinct. And I'm not going to get too far into that right now because we're going to talk a whole lot about it in this course. But know that the slavery that existed in the ancient world bears little resemblance to the type of slavery that will exist in the Americas. It's the type of slavery that will exist in the Americas did not consider slaves as humans. It was race-based. It was hereditary. I could go on anyway, but we're going to cover it extensively. Slaves were often war captives in the ancient world, and in ancient West Africa, slavery was the means of assimilation. So if I beat you in war, I've captured your people, you're now slaves, quote unquote, and you will remain slaves until you are assimilated into the new society. Sometimes that would be for the rest of their lives, but their children would be free. But it was a means of assimilation. West Africa. All right. So there's two religious traditions. There's Islamic and indigenous. And what you're going to see is as Christianity and Islam spreads across Africa, you'll notice that, sub-Saharan Africa is almost entirely Christian, whereas North Africa is predominantly Muslim. You're always going to find parts of the indigenous religions kind of nuanced into those larger, what we call universalizing religions. So like Christianity and Islam are universalizing religions. They seek to spread and seek converts, whereas folk religions or indigenous religions are smaller, they tend to be ethnic, and they don't really seek converts. Well, guess what? Christianity and Islam in Africa are going to have aspects of indigenous religions within them. All right, you guys learned about Islam, a monotheistic religion. Indigenous religions in Africa tend to be polytheistic. They invoke spirits of ancestors, basically ancestors served as a bridge between living people and gods who the living people saw as unapproachable. So your dead ancestors essentially become an intermediary between you and the gods who are unapproachable. Indigenous religions in Africa are usually animistic, so they, incorporate the worship of inanimate things like rivers have spirits, trees contain spirits. And I mean, this should sound familiar. You find this in Taoism, you find this in religions and among Native Americans and elsewhere in the world. Art and music is influenced by religion. So wooden masks, ceremonial masks, are super important and continue to be. Figurines represented gods and ancestors. In ancient Benin, the bronze sculptures made there are famous throughout the world. West African music was important from a religious standpoint. Something called fetish dolls or fetishes were important. These are natural objects believed to have magical power, like what we would call a charm. Okay, a lot of times they use them in like funerals and things like that. All sorts of musical instruments that are common throughout the world today were invented in Africa. Xylophones, bells, flutes, the banza, which is a banjo, call and response singing. That's all, invented in Africa. Oral histories are important. So you have sort of traveling griots who basically go and sing stories that are sort of a blend of fact and fiction. And these traveling sort of griots, like, you would find them in other civilizations around that time too. They become really important, and they're common, especially in like royal courts. West African prose tales are still, pretty common today. And they represent humans who deal with some sort of crisis like death or a romance or success or failure. And one really common type of prose tale that you'll find in the West African tradition are trickster tales. And this is where like a weaker, smaller animal like outsmarts a bigger, stronger animal. So you use cunning to overpower a stronger foe. These trickster tales end up becoming really important to enslave people in North America and later the United States for obvious reasons, right? And so that's why the trickster tale is still something that is popular in the United States today and has been recreated in a number of different formats. This is a wooden harp, West African wooden harp. So like this is what those griots would have played as they sang out those histories and folk tales, trickster tales, things like that. Iron refining and forging was common. Textile production was important. And so trade across those, trans-Saharan trade routes and those trade routes that link sub-Saharan Africa to, Egypt and other North African civilizations led Islam to diffuse across those trade routes. Textile production becomes more important. You find Islamic and indigenous elements in the architecture. Rice cultivation is going to become important, and that is going to reemerge later in colonial South Carolina. So they're going to find that the environment and the climate in South Carolina is going to be conducive to rice cultivation, and that's going to become really important. This is an Ashanti sword found in West Africa. It's got a gold handle. This is actually a ray skin, like a ray, like a stingray sheath. It's kind of cool. All right. So, in conclusion, West African history, we talk a little bit about it because that's where African American history starts. All right. Much remains to be learned. There's still lots of questions about the evolution of man, the role of ancient Egypt, and Egypt's relationship to Nubia and Kush. But, we kind of discussed how, there are strong linkages between Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, and what we call, black pharaohs, and what we would see as distinctly black people played a big role in Egyptian civilization, despite its representation in popular culture today. All right, West Africans um, have West African heritage has been preserved in the African American historic narrative, and that's going to be kind of a running theme for the next several lectures, and we'll bring this up again. All right, continues to be influential to this day. Okay, guys, that's it. So make sure you do those guided notes, answer those chapter questions, and make sure you do the discussion board. And I'll see you next